Okay.
I'm gonna cook dinner.
Welcome everybody to our first book club. This is not a book club. This is simply book club for reasons that are relevant to our reading, which we're going to talk about. Who the fuck is giving me that line noise? Thank you. Okay, so first of all, is Alejandra in here? I'm not seeing her, but oh yeah, she's red. Alejandra, get that shit figured out. This is Alejandra's idea, book club. Alejandra suggested that we start a book club. So everybody, can we get a round of applause? Alejandra. Love you,
Thank you,
Alejandra.
Also, she
Alejandra.
said
Thank
BRB.
you.
She maybe can't hear us.
BRB. Well, she's had problems before, so I know she knows how to troubleshoot them. But anyway, this book club Alejandra asked for, I was like thinking about what we should do because I don't really read books. And then I was thinking that this would be a really good opportunity for us to maybe try to do some sort of very loose introductory survey to Western philosophy and read texts that are relevant in some way to phenomenology and maybe work through them kind of sequentially, because I mean, I haven't even read a lot of the authors that I'm thinking we should read together. I've only taken a few philosophy courses and I know a lot of you haven't either. So I thought that we should just, go through and do our little Western philosophy survey together and then maybe double back and do some non-Western philosophy together. But anyway, so our first reading was Socrates. I'm starting with Socrates because, a lot of people consider him like the cornerstone of Western philosophy. And the reason, this text that we read for the first episode is, sorry, I'm not high functioning tonight. I'm like, I'm a little dazed and confused. The first reading that we did was Meno, which is written by Plato because Socrates never wrote anything himself. I don't know if you guys know that. Socrates was on that analog shit, analog philosophy. He was out there in the streets getting dirty, no shoes on. So Plato wrote down everything for Socrates. We only really know Socrates through Plato. And Socrates was Plato's teacher. And this text, Meno, is a Socratic dialogue where Socrates is inquiring into the nature of virtue, as you read. And what I felt was a good reason for us to read this in the interest of trying to read things that are like peripherally related to phenomenology is because of really what kind of goes on around the conclusion of this text, where Socrates is sort of talking about they're wondering about whether or not virtue is taught or if virtue could be said to be a thing that's intrinsic, and also if there is anything if it can be said that any knowledge is intrinsic, if there's some innate knowledge that people have, if things have some sort of quality in and of themselves, or if we just assign them value. So, I also think, I don't have a lot of you read Socrates before. Like, was this anybody's first time reading Socrates or first time reading any philosophy?
Not me.
Not you.
As in, well, I have read Plato, and I have read some philosophy before.
Okay, cool.
I haven't
Yeah.
read very much.
You haven't what?
I haven't read very much.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I haven't either, and I'd never read this text. It was very interesting to me. I remember like the first time, we read Socrates in college for me, because I didn't get any philosophy in high school. I was like astounded at how accessible it was, and especially like the Socratic method or the Socratic dialectic, which is describing, this style Socrates had of engaging in discourse and asking people questions and sort of like doing reductive reasoning to cancel things out and come to conclusions. And we always hear people talk about the Socratic dialogue and stuff. So I think Socrates is like, even though I picked this work for the content of it, I think what's like really interesting about Socrates, or like people just learning about Socrates for the first time, like what's really interesting about him is ultimately the format of his arguments. Like it's sort of this bare bones approach to logic, that would become like, the foundation of Western philosophy.
Well, one thing that is sort of fascinating about his method is that it comes full circle to his ideas, these ideas of sort of essential, implicit ideas that are before teaching. And at the same time, he starts from this point of kind of an open tabula rasa beginning. And he kind of guides you through, both in a formal way, but also in a very tactical and social way, that you can take things that are not simply, formal philosophical ideas, but also the way in which he teases ideas out of other people, how he starts from a point of being humble, how he is able to get people to answer things for themselves. So it's always fascinating to read what Plato wrote of Socrates and imagine him as a human being.
Right, and there was that really interesting, he said something in the actual dialogue. Where's my printout? I don't know where my printout is. But he said something really interesting about that in it. Remember when he's talking to Meno, and Meno's like, well, they're talking about form and color, and Socrates is like, well, I could tell you what form is. It's the thing that always follows color or something. And then Meno's like, well, that's not going to work, because what would you tell a person who has no concept of what color is? And he's like, well, I tell him to fucking shut up, unless he was my friend. Unless he was my friend, in which case I'd get him to like realize that, whatever. I would try to coax him into like coming to his own conclusions, is like essentially what he's saying. He's sort of like describing the utility of his own format for arguing, I thought that was really interesting and cool.
Absolutely.
Oh, there she is. Alejandra,
Hi.
the founder, the founding mother
Hi.
of book club. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you.
I love that part.
Alejandra, yeah, you said that you were really like excited about the text. Like, what was your experience
Yeah,
with
I'm sorry,
this
my English it's like not that fluid, but I will try
Bitch,
to
you're great at
express
English.
myself. I love the part that you were talking about. It's like he totally gives Mino a response based on what he thought. Like he gave him an answer, but that answer was like all related to what he thinks about. I don't know what it was about existence. It was so cool. I love that part. It's
Is this the first Socrates you've read? Like,
yeah, it's the first one, and I loved it. I love that
awesome.
he was trying to say that virtue is kind of like attached to moral, and moral is like attached to the time where you are living. I don't know.
I would actually say that it was likely the opposite, that he saw knowledge as something that was taught, that was learned from teachers and passed down, but that he saw virtue as something that was implicit and something that was given, divined even by God, that there are certain people who are virtuous, and that virtue comes from a recollection of the soul, an immortal soul, which has its own memory that is, beyond our finite individual experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
could when you guys talk, maybe you could just like say your name so we
Oh,
can identify
hello, this
people.
is Michael.
Hello, Michael.
Hi.
Michael is my IRL friend. Everybody,
Nice
Michael
to
has
meet
just
you,
joined
Mike.
our club.
Yeah.
Out.
Totally. I meant. I'm sorry. I meant like, well, moral is attached to virtue. That's what I meant.
Yeah. He's going through this whole thing, especially in the beginning. When he's talking to Meno and he's asking him, and Meno's like, "Oh yeah, I can describe virtue. Like a virtuous man does this, and a virtuous woman does that." And then Socrates is like, "Yeah, but don't they have to have virtues to do the thing that you just said they do?" I think it was the managing of a state, right, for a man, and for a woman, it was the managing of a house. And he's like, "Well, to do that virtuously and like manage it well, don't you have to do so with like temperance and with fucking yada yada? And aren't those virtues? It's like a cyclical answer." So Minnow's like, he doesn't have one. But I wanted to respond to what Michael just said too. Michael, are you familiar with the Pythagoras dialogue with Socrates?
I familiarity would not be the right word. I read it a long time ago. If you spoke of it, yeah, I will likely be reminded.
Well, I haven't read it, but I was just doing some light Wikipedia-ing so that maybe I'd have something. Wait, is that who's it? Who is that? Do you guys hear that, or is that me? That line noise? Can you hear that?
I hear it. I'm not sure what it is, though.
Who the fuck? Oh,
It's
Michael, I think it's Michael. Turn down your mic sensitivity a little bit. I think maybe. But
How
I was
dare-
reading. Huh? Who was that? Who's that? Who's in here? Anyway, I was just reading on Wikipedia that in the Socratic dialogue, Pythagoras, Plato actually has Socrates make the exact opposite argument of what he makes in Meno. And he concludes that virtue actually is a thing that is taught and learned and more resembles knowledge. I thought that was really interesting. Like, I wonder what would be more accurate to describe Socrates as believing. I don't really know.
Well, one thing that's interesting, if you look at the preface, there's a couple prefaces to the book. One of them, and I think it might be the first one, the primary concern is deciding what can and cannot be ascribed to even being written by Plato. So the way in which that the people did so was by this sort of analysis of style and analysis of language choice and things that are pretty difficult to do with ancient texts. I think any of us can think of a writer or an artist or any producer of a creative thing that has changed radically in time. So his conclusion is essentially that I can believe as much the person who says all of it is Plato as I can the person who throws away half of it and says it isn't Plato. And so, that's going to be an internal question when reading some ancient texts. In the second preface, he talks about, a way of translating this text into English. And, a big thing for him is to make it readable. He says that trying to make it exactly like the original text would be like a schoolboy exercise. But at the same time, he brings up that while English isn't a heavily gendered language, that ancient Greek was a heavily gendered language where words were frequently personified with gender. He also, what he doesn't bring up and what is absent is that the grammar of a statement heavily affects the way that a person thinks about it. So,
Mm.
going back to what you're talking about, Bethany, specifically, is that, there are going to be historical questions about Socrates and what he saw, because we cannot be sure who is actually documenting what, and who is, if something is fabricated or written by someone else. And in addition to that, there are basic formal questions about the translation of a text and the production of a text like this for a contemporary audience.
Yeah. I mean, also, like, it's interesting because we were just in here before bashing on the fact that Jordan Peterson, like, leaves everything open ended and, like, implies arguments and stuff without saying them. It's like, I also don't think that would be outside the realm of what Socrates does either. He's always like, hey, I didn't say it, you said it, like, I don't find it hard to believe that, like, he would have two separate arguments where, they might seem to be contradictory, but they're not necessarily, because he's always just like at the end, like, hey, I don't know, dude, I gotta go. I gotta
Yes,
get out of here.
his humbleness and his constant statement of his own perplexity, that you are perplexed because I am perplexed. I thought that was a great part of the dialogue. It shows you the way in which many thinkers come at it from a completely opposite way. That they come from a position of absolute knowledge, and that they respond to argument from their position. And at times it seems that he's leading, like in the whole mathematical bit with the slave. There is a question whether that's not like a police interrogation where the police officer leads the person being interrogated to a specific answer, but nonetheless, for the most part, he seems sort of open to what the person is saying, though he also knows and has an idea of where it might go, and he uses that to his advantage to make a point.
Right, he's definitely steering the ship.
Yeah.
But I wanted to touch on one more, like, thing in the as far as, like, the historical arguments go when we're talking about the history of all this. Also, Socrates, like, is kind of taking off his beef with the sophists in this text too, which I think is, like, a really historically significant thing, because, like, Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, right, they were all like, team, we don't fuck with the sophists, right? But
Absolutely.
I think that's I'm getting weird, like, interference from, I think it might be your thing. I don't know if it's your mic sensitivity or what.
I am trying to figure it out at the moment. Trying to turn down my mic sensitivity.
Oh, okay. Oh, and I'm really not, maybe you can help, Michael, because you're good at this stuff. I'm not, like, totally sure exactly what the sophists were all about. Like, my understanding is that they were looked down on by Socrates and others because, for one, they, like, charged, like, they were making a profit off of a lot of their services, which were, like, philosophical teachings. And also, like, I've heard that ancient philosophers were critical of the sophists because they were almost like self-help gurus in a certain way. Like, they weren't super, like, argumentative necessarily. They were more like rhetorical.
There
Like,
are some difficulties in talking about the sophists, because compared to many of their contemporaries, all documents that they wrote were destroyed. We have only fragments of people who are referred to as sophists. Time, you'd have to imagine, but Greece was invaded and sacked multiple times, so they could have been destroyed in that process as well.
Man,
the sophists as well. There was an early nihilistic aspect to their thinking. They were willing to sort of question the truth itself, the substance of truth, and which led to a certain type of hedonism. and a free right to everything. That's often implied in Plato's texts. Aristotle references them as well, but it's mostly in Plato's text where you get them as characters, and there is even a dialogue on the subject.
Okay. So, what dialogue is that? For anyone that might
It
want
is
to...
it is the Sophist.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna look up as we're talking a little information about that and remind myself of what was happening there.
Okay, cool. Ray, what did you think about the reading? Had you read it before? Was this like a rereading for you?
I have actually read this before. We covered it in my philosophy 101 class, so I've gone over this text before. I really appreciate it. I mean, I don't know how many comments I have to give that would be particularly like new to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, give us some of your philosophy 101 knowledge. I mean, this is the first time I'd read the text. Like, I'm not super, like, do you not have anything extra to share about like historical arguments or anything that we can learn from your knowledge?
That's not what we really went over. Like, we didn't go through the history when we were reading it. He would just go over the text as it was, and then we would talk about it.
Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, I really liked it. Can't lie, that whole math part goes way over my head. I tried for like 5 minutes to actually like visualize what the fuck is going on with these squares, and I just
Me
can't.
too.
His description is way more difficult than what it's because he's starting from stating the answer is wrong that it becomes confusing. He's like, okay,
Yeah.
you have two sides to a square. They're each 2 feet long. What is the area of that square? Oh, it's 4. And then he gets the slave boy to then say that the area of a square doubled would be 16, or it would be 8 rather. But Socrates then shows him that, well, if it was 4 and 4, that would be 4 times 4, so the area would be 16. Well, how many of these 2-sided squares would we have in this square doubled in one length of side, but quadrupled in area? And he says, well, we would have 4.
I'm lost again.
Okay, so
math in my head. I just hear no. We don't have to go into it, please.
You just ignore
I love you, but I get the idea behind the demonstration. He shows him something that seems correct to him, and he's like, but actually that's not that. And then he like shows him this, and then the slave boy like demonstrates some sort of thing that's like, well, how did he know that? Does he just have this intrinsic knowledge? That's we did the dramatic reading, and when I was reading it, I was so focused on being the best Socrates ever that I didn't feel like I was internalizing what he was saying. And I was going back and actually listening to it and like making sense out of the arguments, and it made more sense when I'm listening back. But I'm still not entirely sure like where he makes the shift towards this idea that there could be an innate knowledge, or that virtue could be something innate. He has this whole discussion with Anytus about the learned men of Athens, and this guy learned how to be a fucking horseman, and this guy learned how to be a badass archer or whatever. And the argument seems to essentially be like, if you could teach virtue, then wouldn't they have just called up the virtue teacher?
The first place that it appears is when he's talking about he visited these priests and priestesses, and that they had told him that essentially why would we need all of these separate acts to acquire all of the different knowledge of all things, that instead we have our soul. We each have one soul, immortal soul, that has experienced all things for all time, and that we can recollect from that. But when you go to the place in the dialogue, there is a leap. It isn't exactly like fluid how he gets that idea. I'm going to try to find exactly the point where he does. So
Yeah,
like,
Yeah,
maybe if you're looking at the text, you give us page
the
numbers. Sorry, go ahead.
he said that the priest said, well, they say that the soul dies and then they're reborn, and it got like a memory and you don't remember everything, to prove that we kind of have this intrinsic knowledge. But I think it's more like logical knowledge. I don't know, like if you, I mean, in the case of the boy, it's kind of like you realize that is that, and I don't know. What do you think?
I want to hear what you think, cause I'm not sure what I think. What do you think about the whole argument about implicit truths and virtue being implicit? Alejandra?
Well, I love that part about the priest, about that. Well, it's kind of like he gets religious there, so I don't know what to think. Like, I don't know. I'm not a religious person, and I don't believe that the soul's gonna reborn. But I get the point. I get that we have this intrinsic knowledge in us, or not knowledge, but I don't know.
For anyone looking for the page, it is 906, and it crosses into 907. It's the bottom of 906 and the top of 907.
Okay, the bottom of 906 into the top of 907. I have it right in front of me.
Also, the leap that's being made is that Socrates says that he says that he doesn't know, and then Meno asks, why look for something that you don't know? And then Socrates talks about how learning is really just recollection.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, he said you can't. I'm sorry. He says that you can know something you don't know. Like you can get to the point of knowing something you didn't know, or at least it won't be like the truth because you didn't know. But Socrates is like, bitch, I know. I can't get to know what I don't know.
Yeah,
and
so
I believe. Oh, sorry, Bethany.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. What are you gonna say?
I was simply going to say, I believe a part of his argument about recollection was as much about this access to a kind of infinite knowledge as it was about the necessity of speculating. Because where Meno was going was, why do we then look? Why do we even think about what we know, and why do we even think about what we do not know? And Socrates is trying to demonstrate the necessity of this, and he does so at a couple of different points.
Yeah. I'm really interested in this idea of this forgotten knowledge thing. There was actually, I was looking at the Wikipedia, there was a word for it. It had some sort of, I remember the root word resembled amnesia or something. I can look for it real quick. But the theory of knowledge as recollection, anamnesis, which
that
Socrates
was
demonstrates by. Yeah, that's like the whole thing he gets into with the geometric hypothetical with the slave boy, right? Like this, oh look, he's accessing some intrinsic knowing.
There's something kind of doubly interesting about that point, because on the one hand, he is showing that anybody has the possibility of knowledge, or has the possibility of recollection rather than knowledge. But at the same time, if one is to doubt the manner in which he got the slave boy to the end, he is denying the possibility that one's position can affect their ability to recollect or to access this, whatever he calls it, be it knowledge or virtue, at different points. It seemed like he was showing the slave boy to be accessing knowledge, which he had suggested could be taught as well. But there are contradictory implications to that argument, if you think about it in contemporary terms.
Yeah, I especially like it's especially interesting in this dialogue because it's like I think there's something to be said about maybe a thing like what we're describing as virtue as having some sort of like implicit like material truth value, you know, in the sense of like, you know, a lot of what we describe as virtue points to like human ethics and empathy and like, you know, things that like speak to like the general well-being of people and what we desire and what brings us pleasure and stuff. But that compare that to like knowledge, you know, like I have a hard time conceptualizing even in this text like exactly what that's supposed to look like, some like, you know, hidden knowledge. Like I feel like maybe you know,
I mean, doubtlessly at the end, he gives that power to someone of stature. You know, like the ending is him saying, you know, these statesmen, they have this, the virtue is divine. It's illumined, I think he says. And you know, okay, so we have this form, this virtue that is recollected by our souls that have come from times past, have learned through a different body, and that by some chance then you may have virtue because it cannot be taught by his logic, you know. And that's an interesting thing.
Because if there weren't teachers, like how are we gonna like get virtue?
But
well,
earlier, someone said something about virtue and morals, and I think that's kind of an interesting way to look at it through. You know, once one assumes a sort of moral perspective, you know, the possibilities of what is good and what is bad, and you know, what is justice and what is not, is filtered through that. And clearly there is Socrates has a moral perspective.
yeah, yeah. I think like this whole idea is really interesting too in the context of like the conversation about the entire history of philosophy and how it relates to phenomenology, because you know phenomenology is like a pretty recent philosophy, and it feels like it sort of exists to fight this problem that it seems like Socrates is sort of demonstrating in this dialogue, that like this attitude that philosophy has had for so long is that we need to uncover truths, you know, like the truths are there, we need to find them, like unearth them, you know. And phenomenology I think works more from the perspective of like we are the organizers of truths, like we create truths. That's not to say that there's nothing like physical about all the processes that like lead us to create truths and organize knowledge and logic and all that shit, you know, like the natural world most definitely affects the way that we structure things, and our perception obviously, which is like a physical process, also affects how we do this, you know.
Well, I'm thinking of a specific point in this dialogue where I believe Socrates is talking about how no one would knowingly uh, look for suffering.
Want it bad?
You know,
Mm.
and you imagine now, with the knowledge that we have, going back to Freud with his idea of sadomasochism, eventually those ideas being separated, and then all of the range of ideas of psychology where we do see that people will desire suffering, will desire pain. But
I
when
think
when viewed as a moral, from a moral perspective, it's impossible to imagine one doing so, even though it may be possible.
What were you gonna say, Alejandra?
I think it's a part when Socrates says that if a man uh, if a man can wish evil consciously or not,
Mm.
like he thinks he's good, but actually he's bad.
Yeah, he's like raising this argument that nobody ever, wants to like if they don't conceptualize the thing they see. They don't conceptualize evil the way other people around them and are like afflicted by this evil. They're not gonna see it the same way. And that relates to what Michael was just saying too. But I think what you just said was really interesting, Michael, because like I think that even the people who appear to seek out suffering, like ultimately they are seeking out their own pleasure, even if it's only in the sense that like they're being afforded pleasure by being satisfied by something, like we like think about like self-martyrdom or something, like that's the ultimate suffering. I am literally giving up my life to like save a fucking school of a school bus full of children or some bullshit, like even those people are doing a thing that is bringing them pleasure in some abstract sense of the word, not like physical pleasure. The word pleasure is so nuanced, I think, because we think of it and we think of like actually things that feel good like physically a lot of the times too, but there's a pleasure in being satisfied, you know so even like people who seek out suffering, like they're finding some sort of satisfaction in that, which you could also call pleasurable. Like pleasurable almost seems to just describe like being satisfied.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what later people got at with the idea of masochism and the idea of sadism. Sadism being based upon Desaad, this royal who wrote about his orgies, and masochism being based on Sasser Masoch, this judge who wrote all of these complex lists of all the violence he wanted done to him. But these two ideas have kind of shown us and have been demonstrated in art and in writing, that the algorithm of pleasure is way more complex than simply some type of simple moral code that we just simply do the good. But I wanted to bring back the exact quote that Alejandro was bringing up. Socrates says, "Do you mean that they think that the evils which they desire to be good, or do they know that they are evil and yet desire them?" And then Meno says likely both.
Oh shit. Do I
That's a
do?
kind of heavy one.
Yeah. Wait, say that one more time.
Do you mean that they think that the evils which they desire to be good, or do they know that they are evil and yet desire them? So, do they know that they are doing evils and desire? Do they believe that their evil is good, or do they do evil anyway and still desire it? And Meno believes that both are cases out in the world. People
Yeah.
are essentially evil, but they're also believe they're good and do evil.
Yeah. Even when you believe you're evil and do it anyway, do you really believe you're evil if you're doing it anyway? You're like aiming at some greater good for yourself, right? Like I'm trying to think about people who have like actually articulated like I knew I was doing something evil. Like I feel like serial killers and shit. Like we hear this from them.
I think like Trump. I I just thought of Trump when I heard
Yeah, that's a great
this.
example. Cause yeah, no one really. I don't think he believes his own bullshit. You know, like which is so weird because he seems so genuinely stupid. You know, but even him and his stupidity, it feels like he's still conning people. Like he has the mental capacity to actually like trick people into thinking he gives a fuck about like random bullshit that I
But he
don't think he
definitely
cares
knows
about.
he's tricking people. He definitely knows that, like,
Yeah,
he's scamming people and he's a con artist. Like, he knows.
facts. Yeah, there's like that famous quote that's always circulating from him in some like older interview where he says like, you know, if he had to run for president or something, he would always like try to be a Republican candidate because they're so easy to manipulate. Like just get them fired up about some gay shit. The gay agenda.
I
I
haven't
was
read this text since, last semester. Did they ever figure out what virtue was or like decide on anything?
well the no. The conclusion is basically like it's
So what do you
it's
guys
divine.
think virtue is? Feels like we should start this conversation there.
Right? Well, that was something I was thinking while reading it. I'm like, dude, this is like a perfect example of like the whole entire trajectory of philosophy. We're like, what is virtue? And no one is just like, I'm pretty sure it's a word we made up to like describe this like
Okay,
abstract
but
concept of a
also,
thing.
that's what I was thinking when I first read this text. But then I was thinking about it, and I mean, don't we kind of have some sense of the thing that we assigned the word virtue to before we assigned the word virtue to it?
Well, there's a
Yeah.
moment earlier in the text that I think is really interesting where he describes Meno's listing of various cases of virtue as a swarm, right? And he says, can we separate a bee from a bee, essentially,
I love
um,
this part.
on aesthetic grounds, on grounds of beauty? And, of course we can. We've found, this and that genus and, this and that type. And maybe that is the case for something like virtue. Virtue would be a multiple rather than being some type of singular object. That the swarm that Meno is dealing with cannot be simply reduced to or deduced to that of divining from the gods, but is instead a complex thing, a word, as you all are talking about, that is applied to various events and people and ways of being, and that it changes in time.
Well, it's also really interesting because he keeps being like, well, what's the commonality? Like, what's the thing that they all share that makes them, similar to like, what's the thing all the bees share that make them a bee, But it's like, dude, maybe virtue is the commonality. Maybe it's a word for the shared traits. Bam!
Where do we think virtue comes from? Like where do we think that concept originates from though?
Do you want to know my opinion?
The morals.
Morality.
Yeah, I think virtue is like sort of synonymous with morality, right? Like, do we all agree with that? Like, is virtue sort of speaking
Yeah, but
to like good morals?
We're thinking of virtue as a concept in the West. That is a moral concept, definitely. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, like they kind of operate the same way, right? Like even in this conversation, like there's no like distinction, but there doesn't need to be one, right? Like virtue is sort of, corollary with our ideas about morality.
Do we think that virtue can be taught?
well, according
Yeah.
to Socrates, no.
Your opinions, guys. Come on, jump in.
I'll tell you what I think. Okay. I think
Do it.
that I think that like ultimately when we talk about virtue and morality, like there are actually material forces that create these conditions that make us want to desire the things like morality that we like give it a name for. Like I think that it's obvious when we look at like evolutionary history and how species work. Like species don't typically murder within their own species unless there's some like good reason, valid enough reason, usually reason that has to do with like their own livelihood being threatened. Like, I think we're all pretty much biologically hardwired to want to prioritize the survival of our own species. Like, evolution supports this, like everything in evolution is not just about how I can survive as an individual being, but like my entire species. So I think that a lot of what we ascribe to morality does like
Have the
speak
pattern.
to this truth about our biology. But I think that it's like a fluid process, because like as soon as we start building up concepts about morality and how it should be performed, like especially within a society which is all just like constructed, like society is like a physical language. Like I think that the origins of like what made us desire virtue and morality are actually intrinsic to us biologically, but it becomes infinitely more complicated as soon as you like try to rationalize it, because morality doesn't actually exist physically. Now morality, it speaks to something that exists physically, but morality is just like the logical argument for how we should organize these processes and like make them work in a society,
Yeah,
is what I think.
like Meno said, it was really subjective when he was talking about virtue. I mean, he was, I don't know. I think he was subjective when he was talking about it.
Uh,
Well, I think
I
he's probably like describing. I think he probably had a feeling like similar to what I just described. Like the he. It seems like he's trying to explore this idea of like I feel naturally motivated to be good. Like there's no reason that I should, or even to be like courageous. Like these are all things that like people seem to naturally desire. You know, most
well,
people don't desire to be terrible.
Be- Bethany, you mentioned earlier just kind of like this as being a nice analog for the progression of philosophy in general. And, the progression of philosophy in general is one that's in line with the progression of society in general. The mixing of peoples, the development of technologies, and in each case, uh, when one provides a sort of concrete moral system that is presented as absolute, it is faced with the problems of society and society's sort of perpetually outflanking its ability to say everything about everything. Like
Right.
what Socrates does that is powerful, and where recollection does have some value, like that if we think about it in a different way, is that it leaves an open-endedness to virtuousness, rather than saying that virtue is this or that thing and having to identify it as this or that specifically. It is instead a thing that is recollected and can be re-recollected and added onto in time, as long as it is part of this sense of virtuousness. You see a virtuous person, and then now, you're recollecting the virtuousness of a past soul, a soul that had died and returned now to you. You could put it then in different terms that what we see as virtue is something that transforms with the problems of society and with the problems of time and space, of geography, of peoples, and so on.
Yeah, and I think also within any given specific context, there's still never like a clear cut answer, because like I think about this often about how like, I'm pretty much like a moral relativist in the sense that I think morality always aims at the good of people, like the physical good of people, their survival and like their livelihood, like, but like, so like it seems like there should be an obvious answer in any given situation, like, oh, this is the thing that aims at the best good. But like since morality is ultimately just like an argument, you can like always strategize some other kind of argument that can't be proved. Like, I think that abortion is justified given our current context, you know? Like, I don't think it's fair that if I was forced into motherhood, like I wouldn't be able to achieve my own goals or whatever and all this bullshit. But like somebody could maybe like make some really great argument, like if we actually like abortion shouldn't be legal because like, you know, this is gonna happen in a decade and this is gonna happen in like, you know, like you can make so many different strategies toward the same goal and like convince people like, oh, actually maybe it would be that. There's like no way to ever prove without a shadow of a doubt that like a thing is virtuous. It's ultimately just like who can make the best argument for a thing, you know?
One thing I will say very quickly, jumping ahead, is that what's interesting between, say, Plato and Plato's representation of Socrates and then Aristotle is that for Plato there are these implicit ideas, these implicit forms, and you know those things are going to be essential. Whereas in Aristotle, you get this idea that there are, of course, natural laws, but also there are human laws, and that these human laws are things that we develop in relation to problems, and that is far
Yeah,
more
but
pragmatic.
that's exactly where we're going with our readings. Like next week, I didn't put it on the website yet, but not next week, in 2 weeks, we're going to do Platonic forms. And then we're going to do Aristotle's beef with Plato. So, yes, that's right. But I want to know what Ray thinks, Ray. What do you think about virtue? What is it? What is the good? What is the
First of
nature
all,
of virtue, Ray?
I want the question refined.
Okay.
Like, ask a question that's easier to answer, which, you know, I know that's this
well,
entire
you were the
text.
one who was just like, come on, what do we think? What do we think? We just got a fucking general prompt. What do you think? What's going on in your head? What do you think? Do you think virtue has any basis in nature? Is it implicit, or at least in some capacity?
I do think that it's implicit, and I think that it's implicit for evolutionary reasons. But, you know, as has been spoken about a lot, virtue can also encompass a lot of other things that I feel like I'm not sure if they could fit under the just plain old evolutionary umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably a combination of like just we're evolutionary hardwired towards some level of like cooperation, some level of like, you know, like we feel good when things are going well kind of deal.
Yeah.
Combined with like just, you know, rationalism and taking things that and applying them to other things, basically.
Yeah. I have another question for you. What do you think about, or for anyone, but I want to know what you think. How do we reconcile this other thing we know about evolution where, you know, even though we do prioritize the good of our entire species and in that way prioritize ourselves, like we still are like on the basis of our own biology always putting ourselves first, you know, like we have to be the ones to reproduce. I have to find the best mate. Like the other ones can eat shit, you know, like do you think that like we have to harness this? Like do you think, what do you think about that? Like the how evolution also prioritizes like the individual.
What do you
The,
mean by
the,
harness?
By harness?
Use the
Harness
word
what?
harness.
Did I just say that? Did I just say harness?
you said evolution harnesses the individual.
Oh, I don't even know.
Like shape.
Like it takes us. Like we have no control over where the evolution goes.
I
I
guess, I mean,
saw
I was just. What are you
I
gonna say?
saw I saw a short video that was talking about these that before, you know, hundreds of thousands of years ago, 100,000 years ago or so, we had, instead of one species of dog, we had three species of dog. And the primary species of dog was this gigantic dog, like a lion-sized dog. And
Cujo.
it was able to, yeah, Cujo, but it was able to dominate what were largely open plains, and very much smaller animals that did not have much speed or strength, and had incredibly powerful jaw, and it had this dominance for a very long time. But eventually, as different animals mated, and as feline species appeared, and as other dog species appeared, which could hunt over, and track an animal over hundreds of miles, suddenly their ability to dominate that space, despite being an apex predator, it dissolved, and they died off. What we are left with, that which is based on the wolves, that
Yeah.
genus, is radically different, but still related to this one extinct species. When we think about evolution, we think about it often as always having these implicitly positive characteristics, but you could see morality as being one that is ambivalent, as having positive qualities in which it protects us, and in ways in which it can actually be violent and can be dangerous to us. If someone thinks of the morality of now, of the ideological battles that are going on now, there you can easily see how, just like in this dialogue, one imagines themselves to be doing good, but they are doing evil, and that was left as a possibility, I think, both by Socrates and Meno.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, isn't that kind of like what you see with, where you can find out with ideologies now that are obviously broken, like that are provable, like the dog eradication thing you're just talking about, like Japanese worker death, right? You're supposed to be virtuous by working and giving everything you have up until your breaking point, and then you die. Well, I mean, that's a desirable state to achieve. Like, you gave the ultimate sacrifice, but I mean, obviously now that shift is happening, where we're seeing that maybe that might not be as virtuous. It's more of a belief now. Like, we can tell when some virtues are broken, and we're kind of like in a state right now where we can see the quality of virtues, right? And there are like different versions of the lists of which are valid or high functioning virtues. Like, I think there's something to be said for the quality of your virtue and whether or not like it can propagate itself. Not necessarily like a point system for what one over the other is, but like whether or not your system actually just works in the first place, and how it falls out of cultural relevancy.
Well, do you think that there's any factors that like could give you a good argument for why, like a virtue would be more or less valuable, like as applied to society? Like, what do you think needs to ultimately be considered when we're like, because we see conflicts between different groups that like are both saying that they're doing the right thing, like, I mean, that's like the argument for everybody. Like, how do you actually figure out which thing is more virtuous?
Like, no, like someone can have virtue and someone can't.
I mean,
They can have what? I'm sorry. Oh.
What was that there can be
I'm
two
sorry,
truths?
like not everybody can have virtue.
Not everybody can have their truth, you're saying.
Virtue.
Their
virtue?
truth.
Not everyone can.
In the introduction, there is a reference to Spinoza, the introduction to the Meno piece, not the whole book. And with Spinoza, he has this general idea of, the universe, God or nature as being a whole, and then everything within it as being a mode of this whole. But also that the way that we relate, that any mode relates, has an ethics to it. And I say ethics rather than morality, because this ethics is something that is fixed and is abstract, and that is either goodness or badness. The creation, the production, the growth, the giving of something versus the suffering, the destruction, the taking away of something. And that is a very simple formula. And obviously, I don't know if it would hold up to reality entirely. But what is the case is that I think suffering and the avoidance of suffering and the helping of relieving suffering are all good measures for something that might be virtuous.
Yeah.
What about like a survivalist though? There's the virtue of being a survivalist and basically dying last. Like no matter what, always make sure that somebody else falls on their sword but you. Yeah, right. Like I don't have to win. I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun.
Are you gonna have a baby though? You just want to be the last guy standing?
I lost the very last thing that was said about the survivalist.
Right, and that is a virtue, and you do see it, and some people apply to it, and they're mostly finance types. But
But then there's like this weird binary to it where it's like, if you're looking out for yourself and not anyone else, you're not virtuous.
Yeah, but then some people will make the argument like, well, I'm entitled to this because no one else is looking out for me. So now I owe you nothing. It's almost like murder in self-defense, It's wrong to kill somebody for no reason, but if your whole life and existence threatens mine, then like of course now I'm like morally in the right to just defend myself and not give a fuck about what you're doing,
And yeah, and the common defense is it is virtuous because it's natural, because that's what happens in nature. Animals fuck over each other all the time, and I'm just following natural law. I'm following something virtuous.
Facts, but that's a big thing in philosophy too, like this whole idea of the is-ought distinction, which I think is Hume. This idea that like just because a thing is natural, is that the way it should be? Because what's natural is like we're all fucking butt naked raping each other. Like, it's like how do I draw a distinction between what is natural and what should be? It's so weird because society like is so it's not unnatural though. It's so weird to think about. It feels like it's unnatural. Like we built this thing almost to like makes more use of existing in the natural world, but even the structuring of society is natural on some levels.
I mean, that's kind of what I was getting at. Sorry, I'll just say this and bump off, but we like
don't bump off.
Well, I mean, it's our
do not bump off.
But so functional virtue, right? You were just talking about natural. Just because it's natural doesn't mean that it is necessarily good. But that's where virtue is. It says to be in the good, do these actions, and then you will achieve the state of good. And those actions are good because they bring you to the good. But you have a bunch of people who say, oh, I want to live naturally. We're going to live naturally. And that's good, right? That's their goal. To be part of the earth is good. And then they all get polio, everyone's suffering, they're cold, they're starving. And so we can tell right now that they followed all the rules. They supposedly got to the desirable state. But the virtue's broken because it didn't deliver on it. Somewhere along the steps, like either the actions were wrong or the goal was wrong. And when a virtue doesn't kind of fulfill that, I feel like a virtue's kind of broken. And we're kind of seeing that like with ideologies, not just the nature one, but the fuck everybody else, I'm going to survive virtue. People can examine virtues and see which ones like are true. We do have a pulse for evaluating these things. And so like, what is that?
I think I would like to say something that links back to the phenomenological concept kind of undergirding all of this. You know, you can start with Husserl, but you can also go back to Kant, where he is really the first to bring the phenomenon as being kind of like the center of human perception and of human consciousness. You know, the phenomenon is the limit of things within time and space. But on the other side of the phenomenon is the nominal, right? The in itself, reality. And so, yes, we are in this conscious space, right? We are within time and space. We're communicating through language. We use these categories to define things. But at the same time, this nature, this in itself, this outside of that which we perceive, is something that, while we can sort of pragmatically agree it is there, we should be doubtful of our ability to know it directly. And so then once you appreciate the idea of nature as something that is itself conceptual, then suddenly the failure of people's, you know, frequent returns to nature as a way of rejecting society, it becomes more sensible.
Right. People don't doubt themselves enough. But I was really interested by what Summer just said. Because you were talking about how, like, you think that a virtue has failed if, like, it's not lasting. Like, do you think that for a thing to be called virtuous, Summernet, that it needs to be, like, unchanging? Like, it needs to always be beneficial, I guess? Like, can a virtue expire once you've made use of it?
It can't.
Right. Like, I think if it doesn't deliver on its promise of being good, and being good brings pleasure, right? So it's a desirable state. And not only is it desirable, but it's like, it's good. So if it fails to deliver on the promise, then the virtue's broken. That's how I feel like we delineate virtues and beliefs. Now we can turn back the wheel of time 20, 30 years and say, if you work at a company and you devote your loyalty to them for your life, they'll take care of you for life and they'll reward your hard work and loyalty. That was seen as a virtue, your company person now. Now here, that's just a belief. We understand that as a belief, and we understand that because the means of which it functions are broken. Like, it's either something in the way of like, hey, don't do that. Those actions don't bring around desirable results. The ways to get into the virtuous state are broken, but also like, I don't know. It never really fulfilled its promise. So you can't really say like the state or the goal of being a company loyalty person was actually virtuous. But like,
that's kind of,
could a society turn away from a virtue? You know, like you describe a point at which, you know, we had between a 70 and a 90% tax rate on the rich, and that many people who worked in the country had great protections from corporations which they worked for. And then there was, by and large, when things became threatened in the banking and loan crisis, a shift towards the idea of profit over the worker, right? And union busting became extremely common.
well,
Was it that the virtue failed, or was it that they turned away from the virtue?
I have a question.
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do we think virtue is something everybody has, or not everybody has it?
I mean, it's like, I feel like virtue is really ill-defined, even like in this conversation. Like, no, we aren't really defining it. We're sort of like talking about it as like being vaguely referential to ideas about morality. But actually, I was just thinking about that listening to Summernan speaking about, you know, like somebody might think that it's virtuous to like be a fucking whatever you described, like being some corporate slave or whatever. And it had me thinking about the text when Socrates is talking in the beginning with Meno about like Meno saying that virtue is the power of governance or something, and Socrates is like, well, what about the virtue of a slave or the virtue of a child? It's like, well, what is the virtue of a child? Like, what is Socrates really talking about? The virtue of a slave? Like, and Summer Night, you're talking about like promises of like goodness and fulfillment. It's like maybe virtue is sort of like describing, at least in this text or something, like some specific a virtue almost seems to like be describing a promise of some sort of fulfillment. Like if you think about the virtue of a slave or something, it's like I don't know what the fuck was he talking about. What would be the virtue of a slave?
Well, I'd be interested to see the document that you were referring to where he says the opposite, because if we come back to the end, virtue is not for everyone. Virtue is something that comes from God and is divine.
Wait, Ray, what were you just gonna say?
First, I mean, I will start by saying that I do not think that virtue comes from God. I also think that
what? This is Christianity Club.
I mean, well, on that note, we were talking about like, can virtue be taught? I think that people can definitely teach people to think that virtue can be taught. Like it's one of those things that people can definitely like, you know, convince people, which is anyways just an interesting thing to think about in its own right.
Can of worms.
Wait, so you don't think virtue can be taught?
I don't know. Because after all, like the only subject that I have for this is my own brain. And like,
do you think the specifics of virtue can be taught? Like the things that relate to like, because we were both talking about like, you know, maybe virtue points to something that's like intrinsic in nature, but because it's like given to us through this filter of society and our interpersonal relationships and stuff, and all these things are like sort of arbitrary and contextual. Like, do you think that those kinds of factors can be taught, you know, as relating to virtue?
I lost you on your question there. Repeat it one more time.
Oh, I was asking if you think, because like, you know, we all seem to be in agreement that virtue and morality might point to some like something that's like naturally true or implicit, but also that, you know, there's all these factors that rely on like our societal and interpersonal relationships. Like, do you think that those can be taught?
First of all, I want to go back to the idea that I don't remember who said it earlier, but they were talking about how give me a second to organize my thoughts here. Okay, Summernet just said, can virtue be untaught? I believe yes, but I also believe that human beings will fight back once they realize that it was untaught.
Untaught? How do you
think
like
people, untaught? You know, so say we were talking about like being just some employee for some corporate company and you think you're being virtuous, right? But that's not actually virtue. Someone just convinced you that it was virtue. So I would consider that to be...
Why do you say it's not virtue?
It really depends on how we're defining virtue.
What's fucking virtue? Goddamn!
We're talking about more.
I would like to.
6,000 years later. No, wait. Where? How long ago was 400 BC? Where are we? I love it. Like, doesn't reading ancient philosophy just make you realize, like, holy shit, Socrates, like, totally could hang on Twitter. Like, come on. We talk about ancient societies like everyone's a fucking dumbass, like, fucking beating people with sticks. Like, these motherfuckers are smarter than us. I mean, we can hang, you know, but it's like most people probably read this shit and they're like, huh? What? What? Okay, like, we have done nothing.
The person that's working for the corporation, you know, back when that was a viable way to sustain yourself, was that person virtuous? Let's start with that question.
Well, the way I was thinking about it, I responded to Summernet, and he was talking about the survivalist, and in a corporate sense, there was a time, you know, relatively recently, as recent as the 50s, when people were working at corporations where CEO wealth was extremely close to the workers' wealth. And then at some point, this diverged. The CEO became worth hundreds, thousands times more than the highest paid worker. And the worker lost their protections of collective bargaining, of unionization, of healthcare, etc.
Let's keep
So,
it in the abstract.
but it's worth getting historical in this sense. At one point, we had a widespread institution that believed that a certain behavior was virtuous, and then at another point, they believed that another completely opposite thing was virtuous. So,
Well, yeah, that's what Ray was just asking. Ray just asked, like, Ray, you just asked, could it be considered virtuous to be that corporate slave, right?
I think that the route that Nonsense was taking wasn't a bad one in
Oh,
this
okay.
conversation.
Sorry.
the
Nonsense.
with
Continue. I
the
was just worried you were gonna get derailed because Ray asked this question, and I thought you were like going down some other spiel.
no,
but-
I thought I was responding to Ray, and Ray can tell me if I am losing the plot. But
Oh,
how I was imagining this teaching, unteaching, or this transformation of virtue is that one and the same institution can have radically different values that change quite quickly, and the same people will find one or the other virtuous based on external factors. And that what we were talking about earlier, what Summernet was talking about earlier, was one that had happened historically. So did they learn it and unlearn it? Did what was virtuous change? Or what is virtuous something that is contextually defined by larger forces that are outside of any individual conceptualization?
Is virtue just if it's benefiting a lot of people? Maybe,
Well,
you
I
think
mean,
or the extent to which.
you
the greater
have
good?
instances where a virtue that we say in retrospect is in the context it was practiced was not a virtue by society. That's like the function of saints, right? Like everybody else was wicked and cruel and they thought it was normal, but the saints saw the right good way, right? So if it doesn't seem to benefit people, I mean, it could still stand that it may still be a virtue. If you're the only person in the siege who says it is virtuous not to eat another human being.
Oh,
You cut out.
Did anyone else get a cutout?
Summer
Yeah,
Ray!
sorry. Yeah. Okay, so
Siege and eating person.
yeah, but you're the only person who has that virtue still. Everybody else is hungry and they dig in. It benefits the group to dig in, right? And you're the only, and it definitely is an unpopular belief. Is it still a virtue for you to hold to not eat people personally?
Well, that's an interesting
like,
question. Let's hear
sacrifice
from the
yourself.
audience.
Well, it kind of makes me think of, when we always do the trolley argument and somebody's like, well, what if the guy by himself is Arnold Einstein? Like, then what? It's like, yeah, it's like, because I think that that's how a lot of people operate too, like I've struggled with this, like thinking about this in my head. I'm like, should I just like give up everything I'm doing and go do like humanitarian work in fucking Nepal or something? I don't really feel like it'll make an impact on anything, but at least like maybe it'll help a few people's lives. Or is it more beneficial for me to like sit here and chase my grandiose dreams of like, becoming some like female something, It's like, I feel like people like create rationalizations for themselves, probably to a big fault, with like these billionaires we have out here and stuff, where it's like, oh, it might seem like I'm exploiting all these people, but I'm working for the greater good because this is my strategy, which goes back to the idea that like morality is ultimately like a game plan that's supposed to, well, I want to know if you guys agree, but I think that it's probably fair to say that morality is supposed to aim at the greater good. Or, okay, if we're just thinking about like what's natural about morality, because like we seem to think like that's justification enough for like wanting to pursue morality and virtue, what is actually the end goal of the natural processes at play there? Is it actually the greater good, or is it like the greater good just benefits you, you know? Like, we're not empathetic because the greater good actually matters. Like, we're empathetic to other members of our species in the interest of ourselves, you know? Like, I have a higher likelihood of surviving if you're all here around me too. Like, and we're all
Agreed.
doing this together.
One of the reasons I brought up the dog example was because I thought it showed a time when an evolutionary imperative contradicted the needs of the whole. So it could be that we have this sort of empathetic quality to ourselves that is conceptualized and abstracted as virtue, and that at a time we produce these virtues so that we can survive, so that we do not go and murder each other, so that we do not go and rape each other, so forth and so on. But that when it is turned into this abstract form, because we have this strange form of thinking that is obviously more complex than other organisms in a way, it could turn on us. And us being apex, us being, at the top of the evolutionary chain, it could come to a point where our belief in our own morality are always believing that we have conquered the problems of our morality could come back to bite us, while also being implicit to us.
Us, like, as do you mean like in your head you're thinking of like one specific demographic of people, or like
No, I'm
us
thinking as
as a collective
humanity.
whole?
As humanity,
Thinking-
as humans, as having these brains and having this genetic code that carries with it. If we're talking about a natural way in which virtue would be, if we're talking about it as natural as like, oh, it's part of society, then we're getting into something that's a little bit more fluid and that can move and that we can change if we think about it or work on it hard enough.
Yeah.
Wait, I have a question. Is virtue a real thing? Like, it does something for us?
A real thing? Is that what you said?
Yeah, like, is it a real thing?
Well, I mean, that's
Because-
kind of like what we're sort of discussing, right? Like, it seems like we all seem to generally agree that it points to probably like a real thing, or at least real processes, you know, like things like empathy that we're talking about and all that kind of stuff. But virtue is just kind of the word that we came up with to describe it. And like within our systems of logic and where we create words like virtue, not all of it is like the specifics of what defines virtue aren't necessarily like material, you know? But obviously, what we do with our working definition of virtue influence our material surroundings, you know? So virtue is a construct. Virtue is a binary construct.
It's something of like a
byproduct
social
of
contract.
colonialist thought. So we don't fuck with virtue. You think like in the future, like Twitter takes are just gonna get so fucking like weird and just like start saying that like virtue is evil? Virtue is a construct of Western imperialism.
That's contradictory.
Well, we are getting to
Don't
a point
tell
where
me.
I do believe you are actually getting at something where we're getting to a point where virtue, the concept of virtue or concept of an ethic, cats. The concept of virtues are being compartmentalized and identified with groups of people. So a group of people who believes authentically that they have, based on their being such and such identity, have this or that like natural virtue, and that other people are wrong. This then tribalizes us and forces us to come into conflict. Now, hopefully, discourse will work out that there is probably more in common, more in our thinking and in what we want than difference, or at least than violence. But it could be the other case that a whole bunch of people will start to see the idea of virtue in and of itself, or the idea of goodness in and of itself, as being problematic because it can lead to something wrong, because you can fail thinking that you're right.
Yeah,
I don't think so.
Look at the world.
Why do you think so, Ray?
Well, I'll be honest in saying I was only half listening, but what I got from that was that we could at some point decide that like virtue was a bad thing because it can lead to bad things because of tribalism. Yeah, is that what you said?
No, not exactly, but I would say the first half of that was what I said. Not because of tribalism, that in certain forms of tribalism, one could look at another group of people and say, well, their virtue is they believe they were virtuous, but they were not, and therefore come to question virtue itself. And as a reference to Plato again, this was a problem that they had with the sophists of the as well.
Well, it's really interesting to talk about that too. It's like, talking about like specific demographics and stuff. It's almost like currently, like we're trying to give more of like material assignings to like virtue calls and morality calls, like sometimes with some of this like new ideology coming out and stuff, like it almost feels like it's almost like xenophobic, like we talk about people as being like, it's almost like your virtue changes, or your capacity for virtue even, just by like way of your material reality, like we're assigning different virtues to different people just because of like what we presume about their existence, because of like whatever demographic they're a part of, and it's also like we're just fucking paying the price for the fact that these boundary lines that are so arbitrary that we drew between each other even became a thing. It's so hard because you were talking, Michael, about how we want to convince people like, there's really not that much difference between us, but that's at a most fundamental level. Like currently we're dealing with the reality that like the fact that there were such like crazy divisions drawn between people, it's like, yeah, we're fundamentally the same, but our experience of the world is like so starkly different, and this is like the root of all our disagreements, because like I'm trying to convince you like, dude, like this is my reality and like this is not cool, and vice versa. It's like it's weird.
I
It's
was
crazy.
I was talking to a Marxist, and the Marxist was essentially poo-pooing, arguments about racial issues or gender issues or sexual issues, etc., and saying that we have a problem of the working class versus the ruling class. And in what they were basically arguing was that when you get down to the bottom, that is the essential problem. But the fact is, what you're describing is equally true, that we're able to sustain a whole bunch of contradictions and conflicts at the same time, and that many of these come with various conflicts of virtues and ascribing of virtues and arguments about virtue. The religious and the non-religious, a question of how people should be treated racially, about the police versus the public, etc. And all these come with moral code. And with those moral codes, the people who believe that they're on the right side are going to ascribe virtue.
Yeah.
I want to bring up what Socrates says about the bees. Like he was talking, like if there was an order for us, like virtue is gonna like live under this order.
What was that last part that you said, Alejandra? I didn't catch that.
Live under this order.
Oh. Yeah. I mean, I don't even know.
I think that's why Socrates left it open-ended at the end, or Plato, or whomever, is that there's an open-endedness to the question of virtue and what is virtuous and who is virtuous.
Facts.
I mean,
I think that's why he like said it was. I'm sorry. You go.
You go first.
No, I was gonna say like that's why he said that about God. Like maybe he didn't know what to say, and he just like said God, and that's it.
Maybe. Sorry, can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh wait, yeah, you go first. Sorry.
All right, I'm gonna be quick on this, but I'm wondering if like some of the unopened or pardon the open-endedness of it isn't necessarily like a function, right? You can't know something is a virtue until you discover. You can't discover the implications of your actions in advance all the time. There are things that, like when you were talking about the Marxists being like, oh well, in a perfect society when everyone's equal, then like we won't have divisions against race and gender and all that shit, right? But you can know in advance, like with your knowledge, that that won't necessarily lead to that.
Right, especially since we came from neutral conditions, arguably, right? It's like, it's not like God is like Christopher Columbus. Like, we just got to get rid of all that shit he built.
We can then rule out, though, for the most part, unless it's disproven in another way, that virtues are not absolute. They're always contextual to their environment, because the virtues you have now may be corrupt in ways you don't see until the problems manifest clearly later, right?
Yeah.
No one can point to an enduring virtue.
Interestingly, that was the argument the Marxist was making, was that on the other side, that the virtues that we always see in the present as being substantial and real and true are undermined in time.
I have a question for you guys. What do you think, based off what Summoner just said, that, the virtue of any given reality is contextual, what do you think is like our moral dilemma in our current context? Like, what should be the goal of virtue and morality in a global context, like for our world? Like, what are we aiming for right now?
Watch where the fuck you're going. Like, an unexamined virtue is the worst thing. That's the root of all like virtue corruption, right?
What do you mean by that?
That not paying attention to the consequences of your virtuous belief system and the pain that it causes will undermine any virtue, right? So like organizing virtues over other virtues, that seems like an almost impossible task to reconcile. You're gonna have detractors, but to find like something that like that would affect all virtues, like being ignorant to what you think the good that you're doing is, and then seeing contradictory evidence and then examining them. If you don't have an examined virtue, or you turn a blind eye to what you think you're doing, like, hey, back in the 90s, like the US planes were always the good ones and they only bombed the bad guys. Like, if an unexamined virtue has so much more like potential for corruption and abuse in so many different applications. And it's like those system corrupting things. But I'm going to step back from that now.
Yeah, self-criticism is definitely a thing I think is lacking in all of our various virtuous conversations.
Yeah, I agree.
Could we say that's a virtue?
What?
Self-criticism.
Oh, yeah, I would say. Right? What do you guys think?
Oh, shit.
I would say that when, many of the people of the present who don't have like a huge connection with a lot of contemporary philosophical thought think of postmodernism, they think of it in terms of moral relativism and the idea that there is no possibility of morality or ethics or things like that. But really, when you get to a lot of these thinkers, many of them are saying that instead that our ethical systems have to be dynamic, they have to be specific to events and a time and a place, and that they have to be able to transform and they have to be able to question themselves. And I think that
clearly defined.
Yes.
Yeah, totally. We were talking about that earlier, Michael, me and you.
Yeah,
about
absolutely.
how people, when confronted with this idea of like, oh my God, everything's a construct, it's like people go to like oh, well, I guess life has no meaning now. It's like, dude, no, like it never did.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
you didn't lose anything in this realization. You just gained something so amazing. Like make use of it, you idiot. The fuck? Let's
All
go.
right, Bethany, I got to get out of here, but it was awesome talking with all of you. Thank you for letting me be involved in your group, and I
Oh
hope
yeah,
to be
thank you,
involved again in the
Michael.
future.
You brought such good shit. Yeah, 2 weeks from now. I think we're gonna do it every 2 weeks. So mark the
I'm
date,
I'm I'm
please.
in. I'm in. You
Hell
guys are
yeah.
super
Yeah.
cool.
Thanks, Michael.
All right, peace and love.
Thank you for
Alright.
your
I,
thoughts,
All right.
Michael.
Talk to you
Peace.
soon. Yeah. Samuel, you were gonna say something before. I saw you glow. You were glowing.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say something. I was just gonna say like something about like I feel like that virtues are kind of like aesthetics, like on Twitter, like people like relate to them because it's like it validates their existence. But yeah, that's there's no. I don't really think that's relevant to the conversation, so I changed my mind.
No, it absolutely is, because I was gonna bring it up. I wish Michael was still in here because I know he has something to say about it. But I was gonna say how, like, we're talking about like how different demographics and stuff, and how do we like prioritize virtue and stuff. And I think a big problem too, and that's related to phenomenology, is like right now, like we're finally as a society starting to like validate perception, but because perception is like completely not quantifiable, and we talk about things like suffering and existential angst, existential suffering, it's like impossible to even make a value judgment. If somebody says, like, we see a lot of arguments like that, especially in like, these Twitter things and stuff. And it's like people are just making these claims that like your stance on a thing is like completely invalidating my experience of myself or something, and therefore you are committing violence against me. It's like we don't even have criteria with which, like, what am I supposed to say to that? Like, no, I'm not. I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, you're telling me about what's going on in your fucking brain. Like, I don't even,
Exactly.
like, there's like no way to even like navigate half of these arguments. And it's like I think that's why it's like, it's becoming very like ascetic feeling to me. Like, it reminds me of fucking, what is it? Beyond Good and Evil? Not Beyond Good and Evil. The genealogy of morality, the like people who are suffering and perceive themselves as weak. And like, it's not that people aren't legitimately suffering and perceive themselves as weak, but it's like we see a lot of people, it seems like they're hijacking arguments and stuff and being like, oh look, they're the reason I suffer, or like that person, like everything they do
Yeah,
is bad.
exactly.
And it's like they're the reason for everything. It absolves yourself of responsibility if like the new just the if how we quantify like virtue and stuff has to do with like your perception and your feelings and your inner suffering. Like, nobody can argue against that.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's like almost
But
like
it's sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say like it's almost like projecting of like things of their own personal existence. Like they're projecting that onto something so that they don't have to take responsibility of whatever it may be.
Right. And even to like, even to like call attention to like your material privilege in the world is almost like an absolving of accountability or something. Like standing up on a platform and being like, I recognize my privilege, almost seems like you're like trying to absolve yourself of some of it by being the person that stands up and admits it to
Yes.
everybody. Like everything is so fucking complicated, but it's also like it's really difficult because I think a lot of people, marginalized people, people who have like gone through whatever, like it is valid too. Like we have to validate each other's perceptions. Like we can't just ignore it either. Like what are we supposed to do about this dilemma where people are just like clearly exaggerating or lying or whatever and like shutting up good arguments because you're invalidating my existence just by having an opinion now or something. Like how do we
Yeah,
rectify that with the people who actually where like these things are actually important. The fuck?
I think it might be, as with a lot of situations, an overcorrection, and
What do you
it's
mean?
probably one of those things that'll kind of like die out as time passes. I think that, especially when it comes to like minority groups or something that are shutting down conversations like that. Also, I think that any sort of
I'm not
criticism
talking
has to
about
come from other
minority
people.
groups, though. I want
What?
to clarify that. I'm not talking about minority groups like right
Well,
now.
I
Like
just meant
this.
just like any individual that says that what you're saying is, attacking their self-perception or something.
Right, yeah. But who I'm like thinking of when I say that is not like, I'm not talking about people who like actually I perceive to be like a minority group. I'm more talking about like, I think that this whole way with how we've been like validating each other's perceptions and stuff, which is a good thing because like, people that actually are marginalized, I feel like their perceptions have been historically just completely ignored. That's a good thing.
100%
And then
agree.
what I
Yes.
perceive to be happening now is that people, because this has become a thing that we validated for good reason, now I
Mhm.
perceive there to be people that aren't marginalized to
That
like
are
be saying
claiming
now, exactly, like it's like now abstract suffering is like the criteria for how I'm supposed to like address whatever problems you're having. Like I think that I'm not talking about like people who have valid reasons, like I don't want to sound that way at all, because like I think it's really great that we're having a lot of these conversations as they relate to perception and everything. But I'm talking about all these new fucking, I swear, like I think a lot of it is just like middle class white people like coming up with weird abstract ways to like tell me that they're oppressed now.
Yeah.
It's like a religion, like being morally upright. It's like everyone try, I don't know. I see so many people like co-opting this language of like talking about, existential suffering and shit, like things that are valid and should be talked about, and turning it into these weird dogmas about identity and like how we need to validate everybody's existence and stuff. And I mean, I perceive it to be as really evil because they're hijacking conversations away from the
from
people
people
who
that
are
should.
making progress.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
It's like, yeah,
I
that's my problem.
on that, it's kind of funny because I think that method is just kind of an arms race, right? Like we were going to come up with an unified system and theory of virtue, all right, but by doing so, and
Oh, you cut out.
oh, sorry,
Are you washing your hands?
Yeah, I just rubbed my hands. Called out. Oops.
Well, I'm
anyway,
offended.
this sucks. But the end of my thought was that by doing that and trying to find a unified theory of a thing, and they're adding their own bit to construct it, they're actually doing damage to discovering like their actual goal of doing it by talking over other people. There's very few like systemic examinations of virtue. It seems like it's more in a state of like Grimm's fairy tales, like everybody tell me your virtue and we'll like cobble it all together. Like there's less of a conversation about how these systems interrelate. And I think we're at that's because we're necessarily at a very primitive point of like coming to a discussion about what it means to be universally good. That's not something that we've been able to have like flexibly or very fast or in a very examined or documented or distributable method. The conversation's messy because the conversation's relatively new.
Yeah, well, I think a big problem is like, we're getting farther and farther from like actually analyzing our material reality, like I want to hear what like Black people in America have to say with regards to like their perceptive experience of existing in America. Like these are the people who I think it's great that we're finally having conversations about validating things like, microaggressions and like all the sort of signaling they get from like media and all this shit. Like these are all super interesting and important things to like talk about, but you can actually trace their history, like it's there like in the history. Like it's not like they're making some unfounded claim and just being like my feelings are hurt. Like you can actually like analyze the history of their oppression and see it. It's tangible, it's real and material but I think like that's not true for necessarily everybody. You know,
Sounds like a lack of
there's
understanding. It sounds like the people, which I'm not on Twitter, so I actually am not familiar with like the specific things that people are saying. But it sounds like what's going on is the people that are saying things that you know, just like making claims about how they're oppressed are very like they literally just don't understand what oppression is what it comes down to.
right.
Yeah, you're
But
right.
yeah. Yeah, but it's I guess what's scary about like Twitter and why people like keep bringing it up and stuff. And this is like part of why I haven't logged in for a moment, because like it's really distressing, like how much some of these opinions and ideas about how we should like quantify each other's problems and shit, they're like becoming the mainstream narrative. Like that's the shit that's becoming kind of scary. Like it feels like a lot of this ideology is like becoming like, I don't know, like some sort of fucking weird religion. It feels like Puritan and weird.
Well,
Yeah,
it's funny
it's like
because, oh, well, all right, I'm just gonna go then. Fine. That's actually, I'll say really quickly, that has been something I come across or reading as one of the desirable effects of dictatorship. That's why, you know, as a self-justifying thing, that a dictatorship is good because if you open it up to the population and then have the people decide, they come up with all sorts of crazy stuff. At the very least, if society is inflexible, then we can't have like all this narrative like change in an unpredictable way. That's not really a great theory, but it is one that I see bandied around about.
I mean, it seems valid to me. Like if you get, I don't know, if people just get rid of like, I don't know what I was gonna say. Forget it. Someone else say something.
So what I was gonna say was it's like it's like hive mind, and it's like, you know, this is why I've had such a, or this is like, I don't know if this is like gonna make sense, but like it's like everyone is like it's like a accepted thing that we all have to like do, like you were saying, like in a religion. Yeah, on Twitter. Sorry, I'm like I should have formed my thoughts more, but it's just like
No, you're good.
yeah, it's just like something that we all have to like live under and follow for us to like be like, you know, followed in quotes on Twitter or something. You know, it's like yeah, if we break that like moral like boundaries or whatever, it's like you're canceled or like something. I don't, you know.
Right. And it's weird because like these are the kinds of arguments like, you know, fucking right wingers have been having for so long. Like us talking in here right now, like, you know, not specifically, but it's like I never validated like any of these kinds of arguments. Like, do you guys feel like there has been sort of a tide shift, or am I crazy? Like, these kinds of things never bothered me when I saw some like, you know, crazy, weird fucking like you're ridiculous Tumblr take out there, you know, but it seems like the more fringe, weird, like mystical fucking justifications of like suffering and oppression are just becoming like more and more mainstream, more and more dogmatic, and more like the consequences are greater if you like resist them. Like a lot of things are just not open for debate, and that's like a popular thing on like Twitter too. Like this is that, and it's not up for debate. Like not up for debate. It's like
Right.
okay, like I definitely feel like there's been a shift,
Yeah.
and that's why it's
Right.
upsetting. Like before, I never felt threatened by any of this stuff. Like there's always gonna be crazy people saying crazy stuff, you know. But like
To
I think
me,
recently it actually is sort of looking like a like actual threat.
to me, it just looks like the modern day. You are not virtuous. You are a bad person, like by default, because you don't believe in this thing that whoever the fuck puts it out there.
Yeah, I just think it's some of these like I mean, it's yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about, but
Well, there's just a lot of dogmas. Like I don't know if we could get specific, maybe a little like we were talking about feminism earlier in the chat, and like you know we were talking about sexual objectification versus like versus like free sexual expression and stuff, you know?
Heteronormativity.
Heteronormativity. It's a construct. Yeah, like we're talking about that, and it's like this is a contentious thing in like feminism and in like, you know, like woke discourse right now. Like this idea that like if I'm out here like vocalizing my disdain for a lot of like what women are doing under the name of empowerment, like I'm some progressive thinker, you know? Like, and this is so popular on places like Twitter and stuff. Like, I'm a sex worker, support my Snapchat. Like it's like I don't think that there's anything empowering about this. A lot of this, they call it sex positivity, but it's not. Like it's very regressive, and like it's like this idea that if I choose to be sexually objectified, then that's feminist because now the agency is now like I'm the agent, you know, like I have control or something, which is so false and not true. Like, but if I even like criticize this, there's literally, I've been called this. There's a word for being against sex work. A swerf. I'm a swerf. Like, this is the kind of shit I'm talking about. They'll like come up with terms and brand you. Like, she said that like Snapchat people are like sluts or something. She's a swerf. Get her out of here. It's like we literally can't even have like feminist discourse anymore, and it's just like I can't even critique the ideology. Like this whole thing, I thought the whole like foundation of these movements is supposed to be having like we're all supposed to be on some like critical theory fucking fest, like but we can't, but nothing's up for debate and everyone gets branded, and these are the popular opinions and you have to stick with it,
because
you know?
if you feel you're not a feminist.
Exactly. That's, yeah. Well, the weird thing is too, it stands for sex worker exclusionary radical feminist. It's like basically like demonizing feminism. At least they can see that I'm a feminist. Like, thanks for letting me keep that, because I definitely am interested in the well-being of women, which is why I feel this way.
It's just there's always an originator of these opinions, and it makes me wonder who is the originator of these opinions, because
it was Socrates.
The whole swerve thing is just a way to shut women up again.
Exactly. Like, okay, I guess I can't have my opinion, but that, and the whole this is like my beef with all of like Western feminism right now. It's so much about these like ideas of like, you know, nothing's based in a material reality. It's just like how I feel about it.
Yes.
If it feels good, it's good. If I just like, everybody should be happy. Like, you know, like fucking, we were talking about it. I don't remember when we were talking about it, but like there's been all this pushback with like the hijab and stuff. Like women from Middle Eastern countries are calling out liberal feminists in the Western world and being like, can you stop promoting the hijab like every other fucking day? Like we are working so hard to remove this thing that's not like some fundamental component of our religion. Like these are Muslim women. These aren't women that are like converted to atheism and going on tour with Sam Harris. Like real Muslim women that are like, dude, the we don't agree with the hijab, and especially with the way that like it's politically enforced in a lot of these places. Like, can you stop? You're literally like being regressive. Like, stop. It's like you put it on a pedestal. I understand wanting to like abstain from being publicly critical of the hijab or something, because like a lot of these criticisms of Islam and stuff, especially from the right and stuff, they're all just like covert racism, you know? So like I understand why you don't want to like go out here and be like, look at these people, this fucking backwards, primitive, you know, like obviously, but like you're doing a disservice to young women who are looking to you and looking to like our feminist movement, you know, where we're supposed to, everything's supposed to be being so progressive and we're doing so much and feminism and Me Too. It's like, and you're out here fucking like promoting this symbol of like fake modesty for women. Like,
I saw it.
yeah, it's, I mean, just the idea of modesty is sexist. Like, get the fuck out of here. I understand if you don't want to be openly critical, but like, don't fucking put these women at a disservice. Like, look what's happening in Iran. All these women are getting arrested for taking off their hijab. Where the fuck, like, and we still liberal feminism still doesn't even want to talk about these women. They'll just be like, oh, like that sucks. Like, but have you seen this like designer hijab line? Like,
Like pussy art.
choice.
I saw it said that, and I really like this wording. I saw it said that the right views women as private property, and the left views women as public property. But in the end, I mean, it's really all the same.
Facts. And yeah, I mean, I get upset at the women too. I feel like there's women who don't want to be self-critical, like we were talking about before too. Like, I think some women are just sort of brainwashed and don't understand what's happening to them. But I
Just
also
trying to get
think
brownie
some
points.
women,
A lot of people are just trying to like get brownie points within the system that they didn't create. So like some
I
kind of
think,
social
too,
hierarchy they can see developing, and so they try to jump on it.
I
facts.
think too, it can be really difficult to have to face that this is our reality as women. I think for me personally, it's very painful. It's very exhausting to kind of have to admit that this is how it is, and I can kind of see that for a
I
lot
know.
of women, that might be part of
Yeah.
it.
I
Yeah, you
think
don't even
that-
want to see how bad it is.
I think sexual abuse is something that happens like every day, and maybe that's, I mean, feminism. It's like this thing that helps women who are, who are victims in some way. Like, aren't we all? Like, I don't know.
You
Like,
mean
I
women
think
who are
I
like
think we
coming
need.
out to speak out against abuse, you mean?
Yeah, I think we need feminism. Like, I think we do. We need feminism. No
Oh yeah, we
matter.
absolutely need feminism. Like, I'm not saying feminism is bad. I'm
No,
saying feminism, what we see, what's being promoted as feminism is not at all. That's my
So-called
problem.
being
idea.
hijacked.
Exactly. It's so fucking, and yeah, it's like what we were talking about before too. It's like I feel like a lot of, women that aren't marginalized, actually, I mean, they are. Every woman is marginalized by principle of being a woman on some level, but like there are women who are much more privileged than other women that are hijacking conversations. Like, that's what really pisses me off about the sex work stuff, because it's like, dude, like, there are literally women on the fucking streets. Like, I say this all the time. I probably sound like a broken record, but like, it pisses me off so fucking much. There's women out here dying. Like,
It's
and
irritating to see someone who's like, it's like a middle class, woman who just needs extra money to get through college or whatever on Snapchat, compared
yeah, and then they're like, this is how I
someone
literally
But is that
survive.
who's been coerced into that and has no other choice and is having intrusive, penetrative sex with men she doesn't want to. Like, like when you promote sex work, you promote sex work, and I think a lot of women have more privilege than others, and don't and fail to take that into account because they have fun with it and they want to keep doing it, and it's
Well, yeah, and they make the
unfair.
conversation about like misogynistic attitudes in society or something. And it's like, yeah, this is a great conversation. This needs to happen. But like, not in the realm of sex work right now with all that's going on, when women are literally like getting fucking beaten and murdered on the streets,
Right.
Like, remember when like all those guys, like some like incel guy was like, report everyone with a private Snapchat to the IRS or something. And there was just like tons of like viral takes about like, this is what's wrong with society and toxic masculinity, and these men like hate sex workers and they hate like me liberating my body or whatever. It's just like,
When they took down that Backpage site, that was like, and it was all these like privileged middle class women talking about like, oh well, this is how sex workers make money, and it's like, well, it's also how millions of children were being trafficked, and I think that's more important to stop.
Right.
Like that's
Yeah.
you
can't just let that happen.
I don't even know like
Can
what
I ask
that
a
law was
question?
like. Yeah.
Do you guys have like a law?
stuff?
Do you
What,
guys?
Alejandra?
Ray was gonna ask a question.
Alejandra can go first.
Like, I was gonna ask if you have a law that, like, for homicides of women, like for men who kill women? You have
Oh, like
some kind of
femicide
law?
laws?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so, right? We don't, it's not like, no.
We have one here. And the other day, I think a man killed his former partner, I guess. I don't know, but he killed her like in front of the police. Like they didn't do shit. It was like
That's terrible.
yeah, that was horrible.
Jesus. Yeah, I don't give a fuck. They'll just give you the law and be like, hey, here you go, but not enforce it. Like,
I
okay,
think
thanks.
it's really I think it's really fucked up, just like in the United States, at least. Just I don't know, like I think it's really fucked up that violence against women isn't classified as a hate crime, because I mean, just in my personal opinion, I feel like inarguably it is.
Wait,
Yeah.
what?
Wait, Ray had a question though. I don't want to. What was your question, Ray? Because I don't want to miss you.
We were talking about how a lot of like middle class women thought they were oppressed when they just like don't understand what oppression is. Can we fault these people for literally just not having an like they don't see it, they don't know, it's not part of their reality? So
I wouldn't agree with that assessment though, personally. I don't agree with that. Cause like, okay, I consider myself like a pretty privileged woman, you know? And it's like, why can I see it? You know, I'm a white, able-bodied woman. I'm not rich or well off or anything. I'm like not even middle class, but still, like, you know, I don't only see this by way of like my own oppression or something, you know? It's just like, and especially I find it especially harder to like sympathize with people doing that because like everything they're dealing out is like critical theory and fucking like woke politics. It's like you literally sit here all day speaking in fucking like gender studies language. Like I know you see, like you're just creating false justifications. That's like it's like hypocrisy to me. Like I don't even see these women as being like ignorant. I see them as being like just self-serving to like an incredible fault, which I think we can hold people accountable for, you know?
Yeah, I do want to clarify that I'm not like trying to defend them. I'm just bringing up the idea that maybe some people, they literally like they are ignorant. They literally just don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, I think it's a valid argument. You don't have to be like apologetic for that. I think it's totally valid. Like it's as an idea, you know. Some
the other
people probably
question,
really
which
don't know,
is a big one and maybe is too big to ask, but how can we go about trying to fix this in our society?
Yeah,
Specifically,
like, no.
people not paying attention to other people's, like actually understanding or striving to understand other people's narratives.
Like changing the laws, maybe. Like that's what I got from what Buttress said. Like the material thing. You know?
Well, I don't think it's a law problem. What I'm talking about.
I think it has to do partially with people like who are critical of what's going on. Like we need to like step out of the shadows more, like which is something that I'm scared of, you know. Like I don't want to be canceled on Twitter or whatever. Like I feel like a lot of people are having these conversations sort of in like closed forums, like we sort of are now, you know. Like I wouldn't want to go like air this out everywhere right now, just because I feel like I'd like, you know, all these people would say all kinds of different shit. Like this is the environment that we're all like being critical of right now in our little fucking private chat, you know. Like it's like I think it's kind of on us at a certain point. We have to make these views more public.
If we try to make it public though, it's like we'll just get publicly shamed. I'm like honestly scared of like airing out opinions like this because like who like it'd be so
opinions like
so
it's
violent.
I mean the very the very like nature of like, you know, trying to tell someone that they're wrong is like, you know, it's almost offensive because like you're offending their like whole existence as a person, you know. It's like if you try to like, you know, make them like realize like, hey, this is like what actually oppression means. It's like, no, you're wrong. That's not. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like it's like such a hard thing to like teach people.
Yeah, everyone wants to fight too. It's like, you know, or at least these people, I feel like people literally like sit around looking for something to tear you down. So if you come at them with an actually
Yeah.
contentious point of view, a point of view that like doesn't fit the current narrative, like you're fucked, dude. You're a fucking swerve fucking canceled Nazi.
You're canceled, sis.
Bye. I was just, yeah. I mean, Ray, you say you don't spend time on Twitter. Like, maybe you like don't. It's like Twitter is probably the hotbed of like this shit. It is interesting, like, but
There's a reason
but
I
you
don't have
see,
a Twitter.
right? It is really scary. But what really scares me is it's like going into the real world. Like, it's not just on Twitter. Like, you see, like the most
The internet is the
pronounced
real world.
Exactly. But like some of these views that it almost seems like nobody even agrees with. It's like, why are they gaining so much like real world validation? That's what's like scary. I feel like I don't understand like the relationship between popular narratives and what's actually happening politically.
Can I get some
You
kind
know?
of example of the kinds of things that people are saying?
I feel like I think a good example is like this. Like, I'm not trying to say that this is like a bad thing or put any judgment on it, but like, you know, like cancel culture, like we're just like looking for things. Like, it's, you know, Buttress is saying is like, you know, we're looking for things to like call people out on. You know, like on Twitter, there's a lot of this behavior of like people trying to like find these like negative things, and it's like happening to my friend, like producer friend right now, for like being a pedophile, like, you know, and it's like it's like really,
Wow.
yeah, it's sorry, it's just like, you know, like people are like taking something and it's I don't know what I'm trying to say, but it's yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even here in our privacy, like I don't even
Yeah.
feel totally comfortable being like outright honest with everything I believe, you know? Like this environment is so like, because it's like, you know, you can get in so much trouble. You can get fired. Like people go after for opinions that I wouldn't even consider to be like crazy, you know? Like I don't even,
Yeah.
it's like we're all like scared into silence. It's like really fucking,
And it's like we have to ignore it to like deal with it, and it's like this isn't a good narrative to like, you know, let slip by, you know.
yeah.
Can I ask a off to the side question?
Mm-hmm.
How much of personality do you guys think is innate?
Personality?
Yeah.
What was the question? Sorry, you cut out.
How much of personality do you guys think is innate?
I don't think really any of it.
And what?
I mean,
I think
maybe
we're
like,
all just conditioned with who we're surrounded with as we grow.
yeah,
What
why
about,
do you
like,
ask that
temperament?
question? Well, yeah, I think some people have like physiological variances that might like, you know, maybe this person's like more jittery and this person's like louder, you know, like has more energy. Those kinds of
Well,
things like inform your personality.
yeah.
Like some like genetics, like hereditary. How do you say it?
Yeah, that's how you say it. Why do you ask that question, right? Like, is it like related to this conversation we're having, or what were
I
you
mean,
thinking
kind
with
of. I
that?
was thinking about like these types of behaviors and, you know, I mean, just like human history in general. And the fact that these don't seem like, it's just like, it seems like the same types of behaviors that have always existed in humanity. It's just manifesting in this specific way in modern times, right? So it's kind of just like what kinds of, like these people, what would they be like in, you know, ancient times or whatever? What kinds of things would they be applying this kind of energy to? That's where it was coming from.
Well, I don't think,
I think
yeah,
the
I don't
same.
think these kinds of people would be doing some like previous century equivalent of what they're doing right now. Like I feel like the way a lot of people are like swept up into different narratives, like they're just the products of their environment, you know? Like I
I
don't think
feel
it like reveals anything innate about like humans, maybe how they respond to certain things, but then if you remove them from this context, then there's absolutely no reason that what they do in another context would like mirror what they're doing in this one. You know what I'm saying?
The reason why I'm saying that it might is because it's I'm thinking about the way that mind you, I want to start by saying I'm somebody that tends to like say things before I have them worked out properly. So
Yeah.
if this has holes in it, that's why. Right. Anyways,
Relatable.
okay. So, I mean, a lot of these behaviors, while like the specific manifestations are obviously products of the person's environment, the way that the person is interacting with their social scape is nothing new. You know, people want validation. People want some, like a group around them that they can, like kind of like a tribalism, though that word has like implications that I don't think I want to be implying right now. But, like some kind of group to say, how do I say what I'm trying to say? People, okay.
Mhm.
People
Like the
want
old
validation.
feminists.
People want to be, higher on the hierarchy. They want to put people down because that brings them up. These are not specific to the situation, but these are a lot of what people are doing. People are
Yeah.
canceling
Okay.
people to
I
make
see what
themselves
you're
feel better
saying.
about themselves.
Yeah, it's almost like, now the more you can convince the world that you're suffering and you're suffering the hardest, and I'm not talking about actually marginalized groups, like again, but I think like, the fact that that we started to have actual conversations about like marginalized groups of people, now it's almost like people see this as some form of like social currency, It's like, can
Totally,
I yeah,
it's
so yeah,
attention. Is what it is.
yeah, and it's social power, like what you're saying, like I think that's I understand like why you brought that up now in the context of this conversation. I think it's totally true. Like it's because like suffering has become like a social currency, like oppression has become that. So of course people desire it. Like any way I can fit myself into this like totem pole of suffering to like validate my own identity and agenda, like that's good. That's more social power.
I feel like also with where we were talking about how there's kind of this really insidious, you have these. I'll also apologize because I'm the same way. I really just kind of start my words and then later find them. But I think we were talking about there's this sort of undercurrent of misogyny in modern feminism. I think it applies to really politics as a whole in terms of how it's so quickly become how conversation has become so quickly taboo. I think and I mean just like how these things how everything is just like happening so quickly. I feel like we've kind of hit an interesting point in history where even if we aren't like, I think a lot of people are consciously aware that sorry, I'm really losing it. I think a lot of people are aware that this hypocrisy exists, and I think a lot of people kind of pick up on it even if they aren't directly aware. And I think we've kind of hit an interesting point of time where it's like cool and like woke. You can frame bigotry in ways that are very cool and woke, and I think I don't know. I totally lost where I was going, y'all. I'm sorry. It's been a long day.
No, I was following you.
I think
I'm following you.
I think that's part of why it's become so taboo to speak up. Not even maybe because it's taboo, but because it's just you can make it look taboo. Does that make sense?
It's
Yeah,
just
well,
the liberals all falling into this trap of all wanting to be the same.
Wait, your phone just like spazzed the fuck out.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't catch that.
What'd you say, Cammy?
Liberals, and I don't want to be like us versus them. But it just
Just
seems
look at how
like-
fucking meek and apologetic all of us are in here. We all keep prefacing.
Yeah, they're all the. Oh God.
Just
yeah.
in case,
gonna-
just in case you
I'm
guys
not
are
gonna apologize.
listening, please don't. I really care. Like, it's so. But that's what's so dissonant about it. It's like, look at all of us agreeing in here. I feel like most normal people are like, yeah, dude, like this shit has gone out of control. And
Hey,
yet,
Cammy,
like,
what were you saying?
Oh yeah, sorry.
We're all the same. Like they just all want to be the same, or something. I don't know. They're just so afraid to speak up, and it just, yeah.
Well, yeah, no
Sorry.
one wants to be a fucking martyr. Like, it's like, especially in the realm of like feminism and stuff, you know? But like, it's like maybe you have to be, you know? Because it's like, then how am I any better than like the girls that I get upset at for like lying and pretending that like like being a stripper is like an amazing liberating experience or something, you know? It's like they're just exploiting a system that never cared about them in the first place. Like, I understand that viewpoint. I was a stripper too for that reason. Like, you know, it's like, fuck this. I don't care if men are gonna like ogle me, fuck them, you know? And it's like, I feel like that's part of my like personal dilemma right now. It's like, I feel like morally obligated to like maybe be more like open with conversations or something. But I also am like, I don't want to be a fucking martyr for this. Like, I've already suffered for this. Like, I'd rather just be quiet. I don't want to deal with this. I want someone
Same.
else to go down for this. Can someone else do it?
I'm not gonna go through that. Like, I'm not even gonna go there with like my friends that are, you know, still in that industry and stuff, because I know I don't even want to know what their reaction would be like. And yeah, I've already suffered enough with that.
Yeah, well, I think like what's so ideologically offensive about all of it is like you feel like you can't even just it just feels like nothing's up for debate. Like, I don't care if someone wants to be a stripper. That's like, I mean, I do care, obviously. But like, I care that like I feel like I can't even express like what I think is like misogynistic about the sex industry. Like that sort of thing. It's like, of course these things are gonna exist and people are gonna have different justifications, but like what's really troubling to most people, I think, is just this like attitude of general silencing and canceling. And like,
there's a lot
dude,
of-
Fight
like,
back on anonymous.
huh?
Just fight back with an anonymous account. I mean,
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not a bad idea at all.
Awesome.
Wait, speaking of, let's kick the feds out of this conversation, Craig. He's making me nervous looking at me. Craig, stop looking at me, you dirty boy.
Craig.
I'm over him. We're not talking about the book anymore. Everybody, did you
Craig's
like
canceled.
Craig? No, we love Craig. Stop. Don't piss him off because
Problematic.
he's got our voices.